The storm clouds gathered like angry fists above the Arizona desert, turning the afternoon sky the color of old bruises. Thomas McCarty pulled his worn Stetson lower over his eyes and urged his horse forward, knowing he needed to find shelter soon. The 24-year-old rancher had been riding fence lines for his father's cattle operation when the weather turned mean, and now lightning was dancing across the horizon like the devil's own fiddle bow. Thomas had grown up on these lands, knew every mesa and canyon like the lines on his weathered hands, but this storm was different. The wind carried a bite that spoke of flash floods and deadly lightning strikes. His horse, a steady mare named Buttercup, snorted nervously as thunder rolled across the desert floor like a freight train. The first drops of rain hit his face as he spotted smoke rising from a small canyon ahead. Someone had a fire going, which meant shelter and possibly friendly faces. Thomas had always been taught by his father to respect the Apache people who still lived on these lands, even though tensions between ranchers and the tribes often ran high. His father, unlike many other cattlemen, believed in treating everyone with dignity and fairness. As Thomas guided Buttercup down the rocky slope into the canyon, the rain began in earnest. Within minutes, it transformed from scattered drops into sheets of water that made seeing more than a few feet ahead nearly impossible. The desert, so dry and unforgiving just moments before, suddenly came alive with the sound of rushing water as arroyos that had been bone dry for months began to fill with runoff from the storm. Through the curtain of rain, Thomas could make out a small camp nestled against the canyon wall. A lean-to made of branches and animal hides provided some protection from the elements, and a fire still flickered bravely under a rocky overhang. But what caught his attention most were the two figures moving around the camp with the fluid grace of people who had lived their entire lives in harmony with this harsh landscape. They were women, Thomas realized, both tall and strong, with long black hair that gleamed even in the dim light of the storm. Apache women, by their dress and bearing. The younger one spotted him first, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt as she called out something in Apache to her companion. Thomas raised both hands to show he meant no harm, his horse dancing nervously beneath him as lightning crashed nearby. "Please," he called out over the roar of the storm, his voice barely carrying across the distance between them. "I don't mean any trouble, just looking for shelter from this storm." The older of the two women stepped forward, and Thomas felt his breath catch. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to capture the very essence of the desert itself. Wild, untamed, and magnificent. Her dark eyes studied him with an intelligence that seemed to look right through him, measuring not just his words but his character. She spoke to her companion in rapid Apache, then turned back to Thomas. When she spoke in English, her voice was low and musical, with just a trace of an accent that made each word sound deliberate and important. "You may shelter with us, rancher, but you keep your weapons holstered and your hands where we can see them." Thomas nodded gratefully, dismounting from Buttercup and leading her toward their camp. As he got closer, he could see that both women were indeed remarkably tall, probably close to 6 feet each, with the kind of presence that suggested they were comfortable in their own power. The younger one, who Thomas guessed might be in her early 20s like himself, had fierce eyes that seemed to challenge the world around her. The older woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, carried herself with a quiet authority that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to. "I'm Thomas McCarty," he said as he approached their shelter, water streaming from his hat and clothes. "My family runs cattle about 10 miles north of here. I was checking fence lines when this storm hit." The older woman nodded toward a spot near the fire where he could sit. "I am Ayana," she said, then gestured toward her companion. "This is my sister, Kiona. We are traveling to visit our grandmother who lives in the mountains to the east." Thomas settled onto a flat rock near the fire, grateful for the warmth. Buttercup stood patiently nearby, occasionally shaking the rain from her mane. The storm continued to rage outside their small shelter, but here in this protected space, Thomas felt safer than he had since the weather turned bad. Kiona, the younger sister, continued to watch him with suspicion, but she offered him a piece of dried meat from their supplies. Thomas accepted it gratefully, realizing he hadn't eaten since early morning. The meat was seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize, but it tasted better than anything his mother had ever cooked. "Your family," Ayana said, settling across the fire from him. "They treat Apache people fairly?" Thomas nodded. "My father always taught me that the land belongs to everyone, and that we should respect those who were here before us. He's had Apache work for him during roundup season, and he always pays fair wages. Something in Ayana's expression softened slightly at this. There are not many ranchers who think this way, she observed. Maybe not, Thomas agreed. But there should be. Lightning illuminated the canyon walls around them, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground they sat on. Thomas glanced toward the mouth of the canyon and saw water beginning to rush past in what had been a dry creek bed just an hour earlier. "We'll be here for a while," Kiona said, speaking for the first time since he'd arrived. Her voice was different from her sister's, sharper, more direct. "This storm will not pass quickly, and the washes will be dangerous for hours after the rain stops." Thomas nodded, settling back against his saddle. He found himself studying the two sisters in the flickering firelight. They moved with such confidence, such competence in their environment. Everything about them spoke of people who were completely at home in this wilderness that could kill a person in a dozen different ways. As the storm raged on, they talked quietly about the weather, the land, and the challenges of life in the desert. Thomas learned that the sisters had been traveling for 3 days to reach their grandmother, carrying supplies and news from their band. They spoke of their people with obvious pride and love, and Thomas found himself fascinated by their stories of Apache traditions and ways of life. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, while outside the storm continued its assault on the desert. None of them knew that this chance meeting would change all their lives forever, setting in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the courage it takes to follow your heart. The storm lasted through the night, and Thomas woke to find himself still by the dying embers of the fire, his blanket damp from the humidity, but grateful to be alive. The desert around their small shelter dripped with moisture, and the air smelled clean and fresh in a way that only came after a good rain. Ayana was already awake, tending to the fire and preparing some kind of herbal tea in a small metal pot. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to wake her sister who was still sleeping on the other side of the fire. "The storm has passed, but the washes will be dangerous for most of the day." Thomas sat up, working the kinks out of his back from sleeping on the rocky ground. He had slept better than he had expected, feeling oddly safe in the company of these two Apache women. There was something about their competence and calm strength that inspired confidence. "Thank you for sharing your shelter," he said, accepting a cup of the aromatic tea she offered. It tasted of desert herbs and had a warming quality that seemed to spread through his entire body. "I might not have made it through that storm without your kindness." Ayana studied his face as he drank the tea. "You are different from other ranchers we have met," she observed. "Most would not have approached our camp even in a storm." "And if they had?" Thomas asked. "We would not have welcomed them," Kiona said, sitting up and stretching like a cat. Even first thing in the morning, she moved with that same fluid grace Thomas had noticed the night before. "But you—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words in English. "You have honest eyes." Over the next few hours, as they waited for the water levels to drop, Thomas learned more about the sisters. Ayana was 26 and had never married, unusual for Apache women her age. She had been trained as a medicine woman by their grandmother, and was respected among their people for her knowledge of healing plants and spiritual ceremonies. Kiona, at 23, was known for her skill with horses and her fierce independence. "Our father wanted us both to marry young," Ayana explained, as they shared a breakfast of corn cakes and more dried meat. "But we convinced him to let us choose our own paths." "That must have taken courage," Thomas observed. Kiona laughed, a sound like silver bells in the morning air. "It took stubbornness. Apache women have more freedom than white women in many ways. But our fathers still have strong opinions about our lives." As the morning progressed, Thomas found himself increasingly drawn to both sisters, but in very different ways. Ayana fascinated him with her depth of knowledge about the natural world. She could identify every plant within miles of their camp and knew its uses for food, medicine, or tools. She spoke of the desert as if it were a living being, full of spirits and sacred places that demanded respect. Kiona, on the other hand, captivated him with her direct manner and obvious strength. She handled her weapons with the same casual competence that Thomas handled his rope and cattle. When she scouted ahead to check the water levels in the wash, she moved like a ghost across the rocky terrain, appearing and disappearing among the boulders with an ease that spoke of years of training. By midday, the water had receded enough for travel to be possible, though still dangerous. Thomas prepared to say goodbye to the sisters and continue on his way home, but Ayanna surprised him with a request. "You said your father pays fair wages to Apache workers during Roundup," she said. "Our band has had a difficult winter. Many of our horses died in the cold and we need to earn money to buy new ones. Would your father consider hiring us?" Thomas was taken aback. He had never heard of Apache women working on a cattle ranch, but he could already see how valuable they would be. Their knowledge of the land was far superior to his own, and their skill with horses was obvious. "I would have to ask him," he said honestly, "but I think he would be interested. When would you want to start?" "After we visit our grandmother," Kiona said. "Perhaps in 2 weeks' time?" "I'll speak to him," Thomas promised. "Where can I find you to let you know his answer?" Ayanna gave him directions to a trading post near the Apache reservation, where they could leave messages for each other. As they prepared to part ways, Thomas felt a strange reluctance to leave these remarkable women. Something had happened during their night together in the storm. Some connection had formed that he didn't fully understand, but definitely didn't want to lose. The ride home took Thomas longer than usual, because he kept thinking about Ayanna and Kiona instead of watching the trail. When he finally reached his family's ranch, his father was waiting anxiously in the yard. "Thank God you're safe," Daniel McCarty said, embracing his son. "When the storm hit and you didn't come home, your mother and I feared the worst." Thomas told his parents about taking shelter with the Apache sisters, carefully editing out how much he had been affected by meeting them. His father listened with interest, especially when Thomas mentioned their request for work. "Apache women working cattle?" Daniel mused. "It's unusual, but if they're as capable as you say, I'd be willing to give them a try. We can always use good hands, especially people who know the country as well as the Apache do." Thomas's mother, Sarah, was more skeptical. "Are you sure about this, Daniel? What will the neighbors think?" "I don't much care what the neighbors think," Daniel replied firmly. "If these women can do the work, they deserve the opportunity." Over the next few days, Thomas found it difficult to concentrate on his usual chores. He kept thinking about the way Ayanna's eyes had sparkled in the firelight when she talked about her grandmother's teachings, or how Kiona had looked when she laughed. He had known other women, had even courted a few, but none had affected him the way these Apache sisters had. When 2 weeks had passed, Thomas rode to the trading post with his father's offer of employment. The elderly Apache man who ran the post told him that the sisters had left a message saying they would meet him at a specific canyon at noon the following day. Thomas arrived early, nervous in a way that surprised him. When Ayanna and Kiona appeared, riding magnificent horses despite their earlier claim of poverty, he felt his heart skip a beat. They looked even more beautiful in the full sunlight than they had by firelight, and the easy confidence with which they sat their horses only added to their appeal. "Your father has agreed?" Ayanna asked without preamble. "Yes," Thomas replied. "He's willing to pay standard wages for good work, and he's curious to see what you can teach us about handling cattle in this country." Kiona smiled, and Thomas felt that same strange flutter in his chest. "We will not disappoint him," she said. "When do we start?" As they rode toward the McCarty Ranch together, Thomas realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The storm that had brought them together had been just the beginning. The first morning Ayanna and Kiona arrived at the McCarty Ranch, the other cowboys gathered around the bunkhouse to stare. Thomas watched nervously from the porch as the two Apache sisters dismounted their horses with fluid grace, ignoring the whispered comments and obvious stares from the ranch hands. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Jake Sullivan, the ranch foreman. McCarty really hired himself some squaws. Thomas felt his jaw clench at the disrespectful term, but before he could say anything, his father stepped forward. Daniel McCarty was a man who commanded respect through quiet authority rather than loud words, and when he spoke, everyone listened. "These are Ayanna and Kiona," he announced to the assembled men. "They're here to work cattle, same as the rest of you. Anyone who has a problem with that can collect their pay and move on." The tension in the air was thick as molasses, but nobody spoke up. Jobs were scarce in this part of Arizona, and Daniel McCarty was known as a fair employer who paid on time. The cowboys might not like the idea of working alongside Apache women, but they weren't about to quit over it. Jake Sullivan, a weathered man in his 40s who had been with the ranch for over a decade, stepped forward. "What exactly can they do?" he asked, his tone skeptical but not openly hostile. Kiona answered before anyone else could speak. "We can track, rope, brand, and break horses," she said in clear English. "We know where water can be found in dry seasons and which routes cattle prefer through difficult terrain. We can work in any weather, and we do not complain about hard conditions." "Prove it," said a young cowboy named Billy Peterson, his voice carrying a challenge that made Thomas's hands curl into fists. Ayanna looked at her sister, and some silent communication passed between them. Then Kiona walked to her horse and pulled out a lariat. Without any apparent effort, she made a loop and sent it sailing across the yard to settle perfectly around a fence post 30 feet away. Before anyone could react, she had pulled it tight, flicked her wrist, and sent the loop sailing again to catch a second post. The cowboys stood in stunned silence. Even Jake Sullivan looked impressed despite himself. Kiona coiled her rope with casual efficiency and hung it back on her saddle. "Any other questions?" Ayanna asked mildly. The first real test came later that morning when Jake assigned the sisters to help gather cattle from a remote canyon where several head had wandered. Thomas volunteered to go with them, along with Billy Peterson and another cowboy named Red Murphy. The canyon was treacherous, with narrow ledges and loose rock that made travel dangerous for both horses and riders. Thomas had been there before and knew it would be a challenging day's work. He expected the sisters might struggle with the difficult terrain, but within minutes of entering the canyon, it became clear that they were the ones who should be leading the expedition. Ayanna spotted cattle tracks that Thomas had completely missed, and Kiona found a hidden path that cut their travel time in half. When they finally located the missing cattle, the animals were scattered across a boulder field that looked nearly impossible to navigate. "How are we going to get them out of there?" Billy Peterson asked, staring at the maze of rocks and steep slopes. Kiona studied the terrain for a moment, then began speaking to her sister in Apache. Ayanna nodded and rode to a position on the far side of the boulder field. Without any signals that Thomas could detect, both sisters began moving their horses in a complex pattern that gradually pushed the cattle toward a narrow opening. Thomas hadn't even noticed. Within an hour, they had the entire herd moving steadily toward the mouth of the canyon. The other cowboys could only follow and try to stay out of the way as the sisters worked with a precision that spoke of years of experience. "I've never seen anything like it," Red Murphy said to Thomas as they rode behind the moving cattle. "It's like they can talk to the animals." That evening, as the cowboys sat around the fire after dinner, the atmosphere had changed considerably. Jake Sullivan actually asked Ayanna's advice about a sick horse, and Billy Peterson sheepishly admitted that he had learned more about cattle handling in one day than in the previous month. But Thomas noticed that not everyone was pleased with the sisters' success. Some of the men still looked uncomfortable, and he overheard whispered conversations about Indians taking white men's jobs and what the world was coming to. The real trouble began a week later when the sisters were helping to break new horses. Kiona was working with a particularly difficult stallion when Walter Grimm, a local rancher who often came by to trade horses with Thomas's father, arrived with several of his men. Grimm was a big man with a permanent scowl and a reputation for treating Apache people badly. When he saw Kiona handling the stallion with quiet skill, his face darkened with anger. "What the hell is this, McCarty?" he demanded, confronting Thomas's father. "You're letting savages handle good horses?" Daniel McCarty's voice was ice cold when he replied, "I'm letting skilled workers do their jobs, Walter." "Same as always, skilled?" Grimm laughed harshly. "These people don't know anything about civilization. They're probably planning to steal your horses and disappear back to their reservation." Thomas felt his temper flare, but before he could speak, Ayanna appeared beside him. She moved so quietly that he hadn't even noticed her approach. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly, though Thomas could see tension in the set of her shoulders. Grimm turned his attention to her, his eyes full of contempt. "The problem is you people thinking you belong here. This is white man's country now, and the sooner you accept that, the better." "The desert belonged to my people for 1,000 years before your people arrived," Ayanna replied, her voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. "We are still here and we still belong." Grimm's face turned red with anger. Why, you uppity—" He started to reach for Ayanna, but Thomas stepped between them. "That's enough," Thomas said firmly. "You need to leave, Grim, now." "This is between me and your father, boy," Grim snarled. "Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." "My nose belongs wherever I choose to put it on my family's land," Thomas replied. "And right now I'm choosing to put it between you and my workers." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Daniel McCarty appeared with a shotgun cradled casually in his arms. "Walter," he said conversationally, "I think it's time you and your boys moved along. You're upsetting my horses." Grim looked like he wanted to say more, but faced with the combined opposition of both McCarty men and the obvious competence of the Apache sisters, he finally backed down. "This isn't over," he muttered as he mounted his horse. After Grim and his men had ridden away, Thomas turned to Ayanna. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "Not all white men think the way he does." Ayanna smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "We know this," she said, "but there are enough like him to make life difficult." That night, as Thomas lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, he realized that his feelings for both sisters had deepened beyond simple attraction. He admired their strength, their dignity in the face of prejudice, and their incredible skill at everything they attempted. But he also realized that caring for them might put them all in danger from people like Walter Grim. 3 months into their employment at the McCarty Ranch, Ayanna and Kiona had become indispensable. The other cowboys had grown to respect their skills, and even Jake Sullivan admitted privately to Daniel McCarty that the sisters were among the best hands he had ever worked with. But for Thomas, their presence had become both a blessing and a torment. He found himself drawn to both women in ways that confused and troubled him. Ayanna's quiet wisdom and deep connection to the natural world fascinated him. She could predict weather changes days in advance, knew exactly where to find water during dry spells, and had an almost mystical ability to calm frightened animals. When she smiled at him, which happened more frequently as the weeks passed, Thomas felt like the sun had come out after a long winter. Kiona affected him differently, but just as powerfully. Her fierce independence and quick wit challenged him in ways that made him feel more alive. She never backed down from an argument, could outride most of the cowboys, and had a laugh that made his heart race. When she teased him about his sometimes clumsy attempts to match her riding skills, Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations all day. The problem was that he couldn't choose between them, and more troubling still, he was beginning to suspect that both sisters had feelings for him as well. Ayanna would seek him out in the evenings to share her knowledge of desert plants and Apache traditions, while Kiona would challenge him to riding contests or rope tricks that always seemed to end with them standing closer together than strictly necessary. The situation came to a head one evening in late spring when Thomas was helping Ayanna tend to a sick calf. They were alone in the barn, working by lamplight, and the intimacy of the moment was not lost on either of them. "You have gentle hands," Ayanna observed as Thomas held the calf still while she administered medicine. "This little one trusts you." "I learned from watching you," Thomas replied. "You have a way with animals that I've never seen before." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, but Thomas could feel the tension building between them. When Ayanna accidentally brushed against his arm while reaching for supplies, they both froze, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "Thomas," Ayanna said softly, "there is something I need to tell you." Before she could continue, Kiona appeared in the doorway of the barn. She took in the scene, her sister and Thomas standing close together in the lamplight, and Thomas saw something flash across her face that might have been pain. "I'm sorry," Kiona said stiffly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting anything," Ayanna said quickly, but Thomas could hear the strain in her voice. The awkwardness of the moment was broken by the sound of horses approaching the ranch at a gallop. All 3 of them hurried outside to see Red Murphy riding hard toward the house, his horse lathered with sweat. "Trouble coming," Red called out as he dismounted. Billy Peterson was in town and heard Walter Grim talking to some of his friends. "They're planning to cause problems for the Apache girls." Daniel McCarty emerged from the house, followed by his wife and several of the other ranch hands. "What kind of problems?" he demanded. "The kind that involve rope and tar," Red said grimly. "They're saying it's time to teach these Indians their place." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. Tarring and feathering was a brutal punishment that could kill, and the fact that Grim was targeting the sisters made his blood boil with rage. When? Daniel asked, his voice deadly calm. Tonight, most likely. Billy heard them planning to ride out here after dark. Daniel looked at his assembled men. Any of you who don't want to fight can leave now with no hard feelings. But if you stay, you stand with this family and everyone under our protection. Every man present nodded their agreement. Whatever reservations some of them might have had about working with Apache women, they had come to respect Ayanna and Kiona, and they wouldn't stand by and watch them be brutalized. We should leave, Ayanna said quietly. Our presence here puts your family in danger. Like hell, Thomas said fiercely. This is your home now and we protect what's ours. The words hung in the air and Thomas realized what he had just revealed about his feelings. Both sisters stared at him and he could see understanding dawning in their eyes. Kiona was the first to speak. You cannot claim both of us, Thomas McCarty, she said, but there was no anger in her voice, only sadness. I know, Thomas replied miserably. And I don't know what to do about it. Ayanna stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his arm. In our tradition, she said slowly, it is not unknown for sisters to share a husband if they both care for him and he can provide for them both. Thomas stared at her in shock. What are you saying? I am saying that Kiona and I have talked about this. We both have feelings for you, and we both know that you care for us. Among our people, such arrangements are rare but not forbidden, especially when the women are sisters who trust each other completely. Kiona nodded, though Thomas could see that the conversation was difficult for her. We would rather share you than lose you, she said simply. Before Thomas could respond to this earth-shaking revelation, the sound of approaching horses brought them all back to the immediate danger. Daniel McCarty began issuing orders with military precision. Jake, take 4 men and get the sisters to the hidden canyon behind the north pasture. Make sure they have rifles and ammunition. Thomas, you and Red position yourselves in the barn with good firing angles on the yard. I'll be in the house with the rest of the men. I'm not hiding while you fight my battles, Kiona protested. You're not hiding, Daniel replied firmly. You're taking the most dangerous position, covering our retreat route if things go badly. We need your tracking skills and knowledge of the terrain if we have to disappear into the desert. It was a role that played to the sisters' strengths while keeping them relatively safe. And after a moment's hesitation, both women nodded their agreement. As they prepared for the coming fight, Thomas realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. Not only was he about to face down Walter Grimm and his gang, but he had also just learned that the 2 women he loved were willing to share him in a way that challenged everything he thought he knew about love and marriage. The sound of many horses approaching in the darkness told him that his immediate problem was about to arrive, but somehow he knew that even if they survived this night, his biggest challenges were still ahead of him. The attack came just after midnight, when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the ranch lay in almost complete darkness. Thomas crouched in the barn loft with Red Murphy, both men armed with rifles and trying to control their breathing as they listened to the approaching horses. Walter Grimm had brought more men than they had expected. Through the darkness, Thomas could count at least 15 riders, all armed and clearly intent on violence. They had come prepared for war, not just intimidation. From his position, Thomas could see his father's silhouette in the house window, and he knew the other ranch hands were positioned at strategic points around the property. Somewhere in the darkness behind them, Ayanna and Kiona waited with Jake Sullivan and the other men ready to provide covering fire or help with an escape if needed. McCarty, Grimm's voice boomed across the yard. Send out those Indian women and nobody else has to get hurt. Daniel McCarty stepped onto his front porch, a rifle cradled in his arms. Walter, you're trespassing on my land with armed men. Turn around and ride away and we'll forget this happened. Grimm laughed harshly. Those savages have corrupted your thinking, Daniel. It's time someone reminded them of their place in the natural order. Their place is wherever they choose to make it, Daniel replied calmly. Same as anyone else. The first shot came from one of Grimm's men, probably more from nerves than any planned signal. The bullet splintered the porch railing near Daniel's head, and suddenly the night exploded into gunfire. Thomas had been in fights before, but nothing had prepared him for the chaos of a nighttime gun battle. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies, and the sound of bullets striking wood and stone echoed across the ranch yard. He tried to pick out individual targets among Grimm's men, firing carefully to make each shot count. From the hidden canyon, He could hear the distinctive crack of the sisters' rifles. Both women were excellent shots, and their position gave them a clear view of anyone trying to circle behind the main buildings. Several of Grimm's men found themselves pinned down by accurate fire from an unexpected direction. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Thomas saw Red Murphy curse and grab his shoulder where a bullet had creased him, but the older cowboy kept firing. From the house came the steady boom of his father's shotgun, and Thomas knew that at least some of Grimm's men were finding out what buckshot could do at close range. Then disaster struck. A lucky shot from one of the attackers shattered the lamp in the barn, and suddenly Thomas's position was revealed by the flaming oil that splashed across the hay. Within seconds, the barn was ablaze, forcing Thomas and Red to abandon their strategic high ground. "Run for the house," Red shouted over the roar of the flames. They sprinted across the open yard, bullets whistling past them in the darkness. Thomas felt something tug at his sleeve and realized how close he had come to being hit. They dove behind the horse trough just as several of Grimm's men broke cover and charged toward the house. The attackers had made a crucial mistake, though. In the light from the burning barn, they were clearly visible to the defenders. The combined fire from the house and the hidden canyon cut down 3 of the charging men before they had covered half the distance. "This is costing too much," Thomas heard one of Grimm's men shout. "Let's get out of here." But Grimm wasn't ready to give up. "We finish this tonight," he roared. "I'm not leaving with those Indians still breathing." The big rancher spurred his horse directly toward the house, firing his pistol wildly. He was either very brave or very stupid, Thomas thought, because he was riding straight into a crossfire. But sometimes luck favors the foolish, and Grimm made it to the porch before anyone could stop him. Thomas saw his father duck back into the house as Grimm kicked in the front door. The sound of fighting came from inside the house, and Thomas realized with horror that Grimm was going after his parents directly. Without thinking, Thomas broke cover and ran toward the house. Behind him, he could hear Red cursing and trying to provide covering fire, but Thomas's attention was focused entirely on reaching his family before something terrible happened. He burst through the front door to find Grimm and his father locked in hand-to-hand combat. The big rancher had lost his gun somewhere, but he was younger and stronger than Daniel McCarty. Thomas's mother cowered behind the kitchen table. Holding a rifle, she was afraid to fire for fear of hitting her husband. Thomas tackled Grimm around the waist, sending both men crashing into the kitchen table. The older man was incredibly strong, and Thomas quickly realized he was in a fight for his life. Grimm's hands found his throat, and stars began to dance in front of Thomas's eyes as his air supply was cut off. Then suddenly the pressure was gone. Thomas gasped and rolled away to see Ayanna standing over Grimm's unconscious form, a heavy cast-iron skillet in her hands. She had somehow made it from the canyon to the house without anyone noticing, moving like a ghost through the chaos of battle. "Are you hurt?" she asked Thomas, helping him to his feet. Before he could answer, Kiona appeared in the doorway, her rifle still smoking from recent use. "The rest of them are retreating," she reported. "Jake and the boys are making sure they keep going." Outside, the sounds of gunfire had stopped, replaced by the crackle of the burning barn and the distant sound of horses riding away at full gallop. Grimm's surviving men had apparently decided that their leader's capture was a good time to reconsider their life choices. Daniel McCarty sat heavily in a chair, breathing hard but apparently unhurt. "Is everyone all right?" he asked. Sarah McCarty emerged from behind the overturned table, shaken but unharmed. Red Murphy appeared in the doorway, his wounded shoulder roughly bandaged, followed by Jake Sullivan and the other ranch hands. "We lost the barn, but no one was killed," Jake reported. "3 of their men won't be riding anywhere again. And we've got this one tied up tight." He gestured toward the still unconscious Grimm. As dawn broke over the ranch, the full extent of the damage became clear. The barn was a total loss. Several windows in the house had been shot out, and there were bullet holes in almost every building. But the most important thing was that everyone Thomas cared about was alive and relatively unharmed. The local sheriff arrived around noon, having been alerted by the smoke from the barn fire. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a fair man who had known the McCarty family for years, and he listened carefully to their account of the night's events. "Self-defense. Plain and simple," he concluded after examining the evidence. "Grimm and his boys came here looking for trouble, and they found more than they bargained for." When Grimm finally regained consciousness, he was defiant at first, threatening lawsuits and claiming his rights had been violated. But when Sheriff Bradley informed him that 3 of his men were dead, and several witnesses were willing to testify about his planned attack on innocent women, his attitude changed quickly. "I'll take him back to town for trial," the sheriff said, "but I suspect he'll be more interested in leaving the territory than fighting this in court." After the sheriff left with his prisoner, the ranch slowly began to return to normal. The other hands started cleaning up the damage and making plans to rebuild the barn, while Thomas's mother began cooking an enormous meal for everyone who had fought to defend their home. But Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on practical matters. The events of the night had crystallized something in his mind, and he knew he could no longer avoid making a decision about his feelings for Ayanna and Kiona. That evening, after the excitement had died down and most of the ranch hands had gone to bed, Thomas found the sisters sitting by a small fire near where the barn had stood. They were talking quietly in Apache but looked up when he approached. "We need to talk," Thomas said simply. Both women nodded, as if they had been expecting this conversation. Thomas sat down across from them, trying to find the right words for what he needed to say. "What you said last night about Apache traditions," he began slowly. "Did you mean it?" Ayanna and Kiona exchanged a look, and Thomas could see some silent communication pass between them. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "We meant it," she said, "but you must understand what you would be choosing. It would not be easy for any of us. White society would never accept such an arrangement, and even among our people there would be those who disapproved. We would be outcasts," Kiona added, "neither fully part of white society nor fully accepted by our own people." Thomas had been thinking about exactly this problem all day. "What if we went somewhere else?" he asked. "California maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere we could start fresh where nobody knows our history." "You would leave your family?" Ayanna asked. "Your father's ranch?" It was the hardest decision Thomas had ever faced. But as he looked at these 2 remarkable women who had risked their lives to save his family, he knew what he had to choose. "My father has other sons," he said, "and the ranch will survive without me. But I don't think I can survive without both of you." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. Sitting by the dying fire where his barn had once stood, he listened as Ayanna and Kiona explained the realities of what he was proposing. In Apache culture, while plural marriage was not common, it was not unheard of, especially when resources were scarce or when sisters wished to remain together. It would not be like white marriage, Kiona explained carefully. We would all 3 be equal partners, sharing responsibilities and decisions. No one person would have authority over the others. "And children?" Thomas asked, his face flushing slightly at the intimate nature of the discussion. "Would belong to all of us," Ayanna replied. "Apache children are raised by the entire extended family anyway. The biological mother is important, but not more important than aunts, grandmothers, and other relatives." They talked through the night, discussing practical matters like where they would go, how they would make a living, and what they would tell Thomas's parents. By the time the sun rose, they had reached a decision that would change all their lives forever. Thomas approached his father the next morning while Daniel was examining the ruins of the barn. The older man looked tired but determined as he made notes about what materials would be needed for rebuilding. "Pa," Thomas said, his voice tight with emotion, "I need to tell you something." Daniel looked up from his notepad and Thomas could see that his father already suspected what was coming. "It's about the Apache girls, isn't it?" Thomas nodded. "I love them both, Pa, and they're willing to share a life with me according to their traditions. We're thinking about heading west, maybe to California, where we can start fresh." Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring at the blackened timbers of his barn. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "I've seen how you look at them, son, and I've seen how they look at you. Can't say I understand it completely, but I've learned not to question Apache wisdom too quickly. You're not angry? Disappointed that I'm losing my best hand and my youngest son?" Daniel said with a slight smile. "But not angry. Those girls saved our lives last night, and they've proven themselves to be women of courage and honor. If that's the life you choose, you'll have my blessing." Thomas's mother took the news less well, but even Sarah McCarty had to admit that Ayanna and Kiona had shown themselves to be remarkable women. After the initial shock wore off, She began to focus on practical concerns like what they would need for the journey west, and whether Thomas would write regularly to let them know he was safe. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Thomas sold his share of the family cattle back to his father and used the money to buy supplies for the journey. Ayanna and Kiona said goodbye to their own family, a difficult parting that left both sisters in tears but resolute in their decision. Jake Sullivan shook his head when he heard the news but admitted he wasn't entirely surprised. "I've been around long enough to recognize love when I see it," he told Thomas. "Just never seen it quite like this before." The other ranch hands had mixed reactions, but most of them had come to respect the sisters during their time at the ranch. Red Murphy, his arm still in a sling from the gunfight, offered Thomas his best rifle as a farewell gift. "You're going to need it out there," he said gruffly. "Take care of those girls. They're worth their weight in gold." On the morning of their departure, a small ceremony took place in the ranch yard. Ayanna had explained that Apache custom required certain rituals to make their union official, and she had asked Thomas's parents to stand as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, but moving. Each of them spoke vows in both English and Apache, promising to care for each other, share their burdens, and face whatever challenges lay ahead as a united family. Ayanna had woven a beautiful blanket that she wrapped around all three of them as a symbol of their joined lives. Thomas's mother cried throughout the ceremony, but she kissed both sisters and welcomed them as daughters when it was over. Daniel McCarty shook Thomas's hand and embraced both women, telling them they would always have a home at the ranch if they ever needed it. As they rode away from the only home Thomas had ever known, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror about what lay ahead. They were heading into unknown territory, both geographically and socially, with little more than their courage and their love for each other to guide them. California proved to be everything they had hoped for and more. In the rapidly growing communities around San Francisco, where people came from all over the world seeking new opportunities, their unusual family arrangement raised few eyebrows. Thomas found work as a horse trainer, while Ayanna used her knowledge of healing plants to become a respected herbalist. Kiona's skill with livestock made her valuable to the many ranchers trying to establish herds in the new territory. Within a year, they had saved enough money to buy a small ranch of their own in a beautiful valley north of San Francisco. The land reminded them all of Arizona but was greener and more forgiving. They built a house large enough for the family they hoped to have, with separate spaces for privacy but common areas where they could all be together. Their first child, a daughter they named Elena, was born 2 years after they arrived in California. She had Thomas's green eyes and Ayanna's gentle disposition. Their second child, a son named Daniel after Thomas's father, arrived 18 months later with Kiona's fierce independence and curious nature. As the years passed, their unusual family became an accepted part of their community. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Apache traditions and American customs. Thomas learned to speak Apache fluently, while both sisters became accomplished in written English. They faced challenges, of course. There were always those who disapproved of their arrangement, and they had to develop thick skins against whispered comments and occasional outright hostility. But their love for each other and their commitment to their family saw them through the difficult times. Thomas often thought back to that stormy night when he had first sought shelter with 2 Apache sisters. A simple act of kindness during a desert storm had led to a love story unlike any other he had ever heard. As he watched his children playing in the yard of their California ranch, with Ayanna tending her garden and Kiona training horses in the corral, he knew that every difficult moment had been worth it. They had built something beautiful together, something that honored both Apache wisdom and the American dream of starting fresh. Their love had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, and it had emerged stronger for the testing. In a time and place where such arrangements were almost unthinkable, they had created a family based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and deep abiding love. Sometimes, late at night when the desert wind blew across their valley, Thomas could swear he heard the echo of that long-ago storm that had brought them all together. And he would smile, knowing that sometimes the best shelter from life's storms is found in the most unexpected places, with the most extraordinary people.